It's time to go over to the third presentation. And now Jenny Künkel will tell us about negotiating drug and sex in contemporary feminist party space.
Thank you very much for the inspiring talks. I will take you from the 90s to the contemporary times and will focus on Germany, where I did interviews with party organizers, so-called awareness activists that try to fight sexism and other forms of discrimination in parties, and harm reduction activists and NGOs. And I also looked into sort of their internet representation and policy documents. I started with a limited observation before COVID. Unfortunately, this part of my research remains a bit underdeveloped. And yeah, basically I use this material for discursive policy analysis, as for example, Carolee Bucky has proposed it. And I want to ask today how sort of the feminist sex and drug politics in party spaces shape power relations. Given the focus of the overall series, I will look a bit into space, but only insofar as it contributes to power relations. Yeah, and I sort of want to start a bit with a disclaimer, because when doing this presentation, I noticed I was really struggling to get these two topics, which unfortunately, even though they have links, are somewhat discussed by different actors into one presentation. So I very brutally focused on hegemonies, took out all nuances. And also I focus quite a bit on the critique of the power relations that are shaped. Yeah, please don't feel like yeah, I want to dismantle these movements. I think sort of a criticism can help to improve it even. And also I want to start a bit sort of by contextualizing why actually this is so difficult to do activism in this field, or in these two fields, sex and drugs, which are both can be considered as morality policy. Of course, every policy is moral, not neutral politically, but these two fields, and especially the intersections, are extremely emotionally charged, as for example Wagner and colleagues have pointed out. Everyone in these morality policy fields sort of seems to own the policy, wants to have a say about it, and expert authority is limited in the discourse. That means also social movement discourse is less linked to social science research, for example. Yeah, and I want to briefly sort of point out a few aspects about what makes these morality policy fields so complicated. One is that it's particularly prone to having the counter discourses, the activist discourses, mirror the hegemonic discourse because they are so strong, they're so emotionally laden. Gayatri Spivak has pointed to this already in 1988 with regard to a highly morally charged field, the widow sacrifice in India, which was forbidden by the Brits in 1830. And she's sort of very often quoted to be the one who criticized this as a movement of white men saving brown women from brown men. But her argument is actually a lot more sophisticated. She's also very much criticizing the counter discourse of the sort of the Indian elites, male elites, who countered this prohibition discourse with a rather liberal discourse saying the woman actually wanted to die. And she points out how these two sentences go a long way to legitimize each other, and questions sort of who is able to speak, who is speaking and who's able to speak in such a power-laden discourse. She bemoans that the women's voice consciousness is never heard, but what is important to note that even if it would be heard, it would not be ideology transcendent, because of the heterogeneity. No person can ever speak for the whole group, no women for all women, and also because of the sort of the need to make oneself heard in the hegemonic discourse. Yeah, and sort of the argument that I'm starting to make is a bit that the feminist movements that I'm looking at in the party scenes, that they basically, that they're so caught up in this prohibition, non-prohibition discourses that they tend to overlook a bit the complications that come into the field by neoliberalization, by revalorization in the drug and the sexual field. I will start with the sexual field, where we are sort of very often, somewhat still in this 1970s discourse of women being passive in sexuality and sort of the male aggressor. And sometimes I feel it's a bit overlooked that neoliberal discourses very much have come to on the first side, treat women as equal, that the performance imperative is working for women. However, the good, the ideal woman, the hegemonic woman, that is a cis hetero woman, is of course positioned in a hierarchical position, and sort of these neoliberal discourses, as in magazines, for example, call for basically taking care of the male masculinity when, for example, sexercising for orgasm. And what I want to point out is that sort of there's not just a sexualization of women going on, but that this has, sort of proposed by magazines and women stupidly adhering to it. But this has to do with material conditions, with shifts in material conditions, as Ipaeus has pointed out in several books. She basically makes the argument that already with the shift from pre-modern marriage, which was based on status, on wealth, people with equal wealth were getting married, to a modern marriage of love. Sort of things get, on the one hand, a bit more classless, not totally, of course, but more gender asymmetrical, because wealth, for example, a lack of wealth could be compensated by sexiness, which became a social value as such. Nevertheless, men are on average richer than women. Women still caring a lot more for children. Neoliberal precarization and made that even more pronounced. And women sort of lost, which is, as she says, in the sexual field by sexual emancipation. Sex is sort of no longer seen as something that women own, that they are gatekeeping. And if a man in this heterosexual hegemonic discourse, if a man wants it, he has to at least buy a dinner or something. But sort of the new constructions go in the direction that we exchange this on an equal basis, but with a non-equal background. So to sum up a bit, we have on the one hand a high sexualization that is sort of based in material conditions where women are put into competition with each other. On the other hand, this has led to sort of feminism and especially liberal middle class women sort of joining in, I'll make that very short, sort of a neoliberal trend towards more punitive responses to social issues for various issues, vulnerabilities, and when joining the workforce, co-optation, but also, as Elisabeth Bernstein has pointed out, because they feel threatened in the private sphere, in the sexual field, and there's sort of sexualities outside the home are increasingly problematized and addressed with it became more common to address them with punitive logics. Both sort of a background for the partying field where sexual violence is an issue on the one hand, and on the other hand, people are in a highly sexualized environments outside the home. I will very briefly run through sort of similar trends in the drug field, where we also don't have this clear split anymore that I see in the movement discourse, that there's sort of bad drug prohibition and sort of a good leftist counter discourse, but part of or the counter discourse on prohibition is rather entrenched by neoliberal ideas, as exemplified by Milton Friedman, the neoliberal economist of the Chicago School, who very strongly argued for legalization of drugs, and, for example, joined a petition making the argument that this would mean less spending on law enforcement and gaining state money by taxation. Similarly, when looking sort of at the urban level, which is interesting here in our project, there are many complicities of neoliberal urban politics and sort of in drug permissiveness. Many scholars have noted with regard to the nighttime economy in times of urban entrepreneurialization, that there's a deregulation or appeasement of protest against certain nighttime economies that are an image factor in these cities. There's quite a bit of literature on drug consumption rooms as an element of public order in neoliberalizing cities, and also sort of argued for by neoliberal arguments of evidence-based policy, for example, and cities with ever tighter municipality budgets, also part of a movement to sort of responsibilize drug consumers, which is very often or mostly studied with regard to gay people and chemsexes, for taking better care of themselves and their health. And that's sort of as a background, what I sort of want to show in this really very, very sketchy overview is that being caught up in these pro-contra heavily contested discourses, I would say in the party places in the feminist politics there, these being caught up in neoliberalized discourses is not always restricted. When we ask, or when I ask the very standard question, what is sort of represented as the problem by feminists who organize parties, who care for well-being in parties, first of all, it's becomes very obvious that there is actually like not, even though the topics overlap drugs and sex or sexism in parties, there's somewhat different actor structures of who is interested in caring about what topic. The topic of drugs and harm reduction is an older issue where NGOs have expanded their clientele towards more integrated, socially integrated consumers, including parties. So they are a significant actor in that field, and volunteers who are helping with harm reduction, joining them, stem very often from a rather hedonist context of happy drug use, and do not have the severe pressure basically to join as volunteers, because there is already an NGO structure. Whereas sort of the topic of sexism in parties as a political issue is a lot newer, and it's very much a volunteer based or activist based driven project. Very often I found people who are volunteering in these structures having experienced some kind of having made negative experience with sexism in or even sexual violence in party contexts themselves, sometimes even calling themselves explicitly survivors. And yeah, they're sort of the ones that very much promote the party politics with regard to sex and sexism. Club owners and urban diversity policies show some interest, but there's really not yet significant state money in it. Yeah, and in this constellation, when I looked at what is sort of seen as the problem with regard to drugs, it's clearly not drugs themselves, even if they're not necessarily seen as unproblematic, they're clearly not seen as problematic, but unsafe consumption, bad trips, and sort of a larger context of prohibition of drugs. And the solutions that are experimented are providing spaces of care, but notably not of consumption, providing information that's a very individualized information that is aiming at the responsibilization of the consumers to have safer drug use, safer sex, and sort of in a larger frame, legalization is generally favored. Whereas sort of with regard to the sexual politics, sexual assault, sexual discrimination is clearly sort of the topic related to a larger sexist society. But as I will later show, there is a bit of a conflation of structure and individuals. So the hetero cis man comes very much in the focus as being sort of the bearer of these problematic traits. In this context, sex and drugs are not far from generally, and sex more so as drugs, but sometimes comes to be seen as a problem as such. The solution that sort of match with this problem framing is also providing spaces of care, also providing information, but this time this information is a lot more collective awareness, a lot more politicized than sort of the drug harm prevention information. The idea is to make people aware for power-laden society and address discrimination. However, sort of with exception, very often also a strong element of awareness is a policing of space, of I see more sort of attempts stemming from this field of sort of desexing or de-drugging the environment, for example, by having a party only after a lecture. Yeah, to what I find actually most problematic in this field is that criminalization is, at least in parts of this movement, a favored solution. Yeah, when I will now look a bit deeper into this, but still, as I said, yeah, it's really brutal to reduce the whole complexity of what people are doing, of this also very great activism, into whatever 4 quotes on drugs and 4 on sex. Yeah, to keep that in mind. But still, when we look at what is sort of done about drugs, what is the idea of approaching, the main ideas of approaching drugs in the party context, I would say it's a very liberal approach based on pro-choice arguments. For example, one activist explains from how a voluntary association sees its work. She says the idea behind it is very humanist. People should determine their own lives, bodies, etc. And nowadays we have scientific opinions that repressive drug policy doesn't work. And the state will not close this gap, and what they do is to sort of solve this problem is provide, on the one hand, information to help to take better care of drug users, to take better care of themselves, and secondly, to accompany basically bad trips, holding hands. So yeah, you can see repression, drug prohibition is clearly criticized, but the solutions are very individualized. Yeah, and I would say that that's sort of a general trend, sort of this production of responsible subjects, even though quite often in these interviews, it is somewhat mentioned that this is done sort of in the wrong world, in a power-laden world. Here, for example, one harm reduction activist says, yeah, it's not only people testing their limits substance-wise or regarding sexuality, but it's also the performance ideas of our society that are the problem, and why sort of partially this is going a bit over the edge. It's like a sport, the people actually planning this going over the edge. And from a public health perspective, we encourage this planning, this reflection, the next step of the next step. Okay, what substances do I like? Does it make sense, etc. So there is always this ambivalence between, yes, there is a certain reference to society's power structures, but when it comes to the solutions, it's clearly individualized. And yeah, to sum up sort of the drug issue very briefly, I would say what remains a bit, not a gap in the in the discourse is I lost track a bit. Excuse me. Yeah, to sum it up, what remains a bit of a gap, or is rarely mentioned, is sort of what is the problem, or sort of how is drug consumption produced beyond prohibition? And one activist did mention this. She says, for example, yeah, drugs relieve stress, including socially produced stress. That's always a critique, escapism, flight of reality, especially since it's commercially steered in Berlin, especially at the intersection of techno-hedonist and political scene. This is very critically reflected, since it keeps you from acting politically. And I totally believe her that this is very much discussed. However, sort of in what I looked at so far, this intersection of techno-hedonist and political scene is sort of a small niche and sort of in the bigger picture, such dealings with society beyond criticizing prohibition are relatively rare. And this has also to do with sort of with my focus of the research project also on sort of feminist party spaces, but also with the focus of the feminists on sexuality. I very often found that the feminists I interviewed are really not very much interested in drugs and don't feel like dealing with it in depth is very important. But on the contrary, sex is a very prominent topic, especially sexism. But in this context, ever and ever again, sexuality as such sort of is somehow seen as a problem, with an exception of sex parties, sex positive sex parties, which are a super interesting topic, but due to time reasons, I will just sort of mention how they are interestingly enough seen by people who are not organizing sex parties, but awareness in other parties. And very often I came across sort of a reading of these situations that actually in parties where sex is made explicit, things are easier. And the problem stems from having in sort of mainstream parties, even mainstream leftist parties, but not sex parties. The problem is you have a sexualized scene, and if it's not a sex club, then it's difficult. People have sex on the toilet and in hidden rooms, but since sex is not the primary focus, as it is the case at sex parties, there's not this super intense reflection. Yeah, and nevertheless, while this quotation would somehow make one think that sort of providing spaces, providing this information, doing this reflection would help sort of the hegemonic approach of party organizers to fight sexism in parties is currently awareness. That's sort of an approach that on the one hand means looking out for each other, and where it's sort of made very prominent at the parties that discrimination should not happen. So there is a strong preventive aspect. However, there's also sort of a certain tendency, at least awareness that takes place at parties, that it's sort of not so much a collective issue, but rather something that is outsourced to so-called awareness teams that look around in the room, that everyone is well and make themselves approachable. Okay, I'm a bit wondering about the chat. Okay. Yes, I'm trying to be fast with closing up. Yeah, when you look at these awareness concepts, one activist said the concepts how to proceed there are everywhere pretty much the same. That's maybe a bit of an over-exaggeration, but it's true that sort of the German awareness concepts, they have very much developed from few projects, from few handbooks, building up on each other, which is a bit unfortunate insofar as they have merged with an older concept in German leftist feminism, where sort of the so-called power of definition is granted to the person who experiences discrimination. That is sort of basically the ideal that a woman who says she has made a sexist experience or sexual violence experience shall not be questioned, or someone who, a Black person who experienced racism should not be questioned, which is sort of an important criticism of constant questioning if such things have happened. On the other hand, what is happening due to this these concepts in the awareness work, or at least the representation that I've been analyzing, is a bit of a conflation of structure that is collapsed into individuals. Oops. Yeah, and that leads to tendency to a bit reify women as weak. As for example, one panelist at a workshop about awareness, she's describing what she sees as the history of awareness. She says cis women no longer wanted to be a fair game. They didn't want to learn to defend themselves. Sorry, I really need to move this stupid window to the side, because I cannot read my slides. They didn't want to learn to defend themselves, thus awareness is empowerment. And I find that very interesting, that she sort of defines not wanting to learn something as empowerment. It's sort of a move that allows to legitimize why there's sort of awareness teams needed to take over the work. Yeah, I do not want to say that the work of awareness teams is not absolutely heterogeneous, and that sort of the mere presence at parties and the sort of the flyers that announce them and so on they do make an important contribution to raising awareness for the issue of discrimination and power relations. However, there's also sort of within this approach certain tendency, to police space for the weak genders. Sanctions are an included option, and in a debate around festivals, sexual violence at a festival by making secret pornography, there was a strong, at least in the public debate, a strong call for dealing with this by criminal law. Again, here there remains to be seen, because I think within this sort of making this a topic, there was quite a strong movement to create longer lasting structures. Nevertheless, I want to problematize a bit these carceral logics that are ingrained here in the approach, and which I feel I'm getting there, Mélina, don't worry. Which sort of linking this so much to a discourse on guilt, on sanctions, sort of goes along with the logic of assault. What is seen as problem is mostly getting too close, discriminating, but not, for example, not being included, not being seen as sexual. It's sort of a collapsing of vulnerability and social group. I will skip a bit because Mélina is getting impatient. And just saying, sort of getting back to the beginnings where I said, women are highly sexualized. They're not stupid, but they're put in a competitive situation where sexuality is not only fun but also a social value. I think we need to sort of stop interpreting these situations so much in terms of guilt, in terms of sanctions, and rather looking at sort of the mechanisms of how we are, like, both men and women are produced as sexual subjects, and how these sort of situations of from discomfort to assault are produced, and their material backgrounds. To sum up, there are clearly new forms of collective care and of awareness, sort of politicization experimented, which is sort of from a progressive activist researcher perspective great. Yet I feel the movement is, as a young movement, still a bit caught up in sort of old drug and sex war binaries and a sort of a politics of vulnerability that is conflating, collapsing structure into individuals, and therefore sort of reinforcing gender stereotypes. And this also fuels, has a tendency to fuel carceral logics in the sexual field, and in the drug policy field, sort of reinforcing neoliberal logics of community care and responsibilization. Yeah, I'll stop with this.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you very much for your intervention. Now we have time for discussion and questions. Please write your name or write a comment in the discussion so I can see you and invite you to ask your question. You can also type your question. Please.
Hi, I thank you for this. This is really interesting. But I was wondering about like the difference between like a punishment and a consequence. So I see like the carceral feminist logic in awareness teams, and even like the call for a different kind of, you know, law enforcement responses and stuff like that very critically, but I would not necessarily see all types of like consequence as being part of like a carceral logic. And I was just wondering if you kind of like differentiate between different calls for, you know, what to do with people who harm in party spaces, or if you would just say it's all part of like a carceral feminist logic.
No, no, of course not. No, and I wouldn't say that sort of like awareness is a carceral logic. I try to sort of say that there's a lot of sort of attempt to change minds, really. But I don't know what I feel you might be pointing at. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's a bit like this debate about is it okay to exclude people from the party? Is that a punishment? Is that what is it? Sort of, I find a bit the debate difficult insofar as from the perspective of the person who's excluded, depending on how long-term this exclusion is and how important this space is for the person, this may be experienced as a punishment. But what I wanted to, that's why I pointed to this debate. Many people here probably know it, about Moni's Rache, the festival where the secret porn, or not secret porn, people were filmed in the toilet, and this was sort of sold as pornography, which is clearly a violent act. But that's why I pointed to this, that sort of the leap from these two carceral logics are very easy here, and in this debate it was clearly like, again, I think there's sort of longer structures being built up, probably now that I partially might not know about, but still sort of in the debate it was very clearly that favoring of criminal law, extension of criminal law, that such a behavior should not only be punished as sort of intrusion in privacy, but sort of clearly as a sexual crime, was a very important voice in the debate. But again, a heterogeneous debate, that where also other ideas were promoted.
And maybe I can just like say something quickly to that, because I like really just personally do see this attempt to kind of like build on the history of Definitionsmacht with like approaches of transformative justice and community accountability and ideas like that. Like this idea of like not disregarding these movements that have been really important, but kind of like taking them to a different, like a step further, where like we do also consider people who have harmed as like humans who deserve spaces of community and who deserve care and like who deserve not to be just disregarded and discarded. But I feel like it is a very difficult conversation still. So I think interventions like yours, like pointing out the carceral logic of these things, are really important. But I feel like people are trying to move beyond that.
Yeah, and I think that's really like that's why I said so many times in the presentation, please be cautious with what I'm saying, because it's really like even within the awareness movements, of course there are quite different opinions, and still I would say there's an interesting continuity, like also when you look at really the books that I for example show, the book by Wiesenthal, who's very prominent in debate. She's a clear proponent of this concept of Definitionsmacht, the power to define, and other books that sometimes have been written by the same people, but with other people which stem more from an Anglo-Saxon context, which don't sort of have this German drift, I call it by lack of a better word in it, that I think causes a lot of problems if you sort of, also for the people, they're really very, when I interviewed them, they're sometimes very frustrated what to do, because they're all super concerned about intersectionality, for example, about not having a white movement doing justice to people who are discriminated against by other forms of power relations and gender relations, and still then what they tell me is like, but when there's sort of a conflict between someone saying, I've been stared at here at the party by this guy, and the guy says, no, I didn't stare, or sort of even more problematic for the people, no, this is a racist assumption that I stared. They feel really helpless in this situation, and sort of with the logic of the power to define, sort of they say, but then Wiesenthal says I have to build 2 awareness groups, and I think really like that's why I said we have to get rid of this thinking in terms of guilt, in terms of and thinking more like really not just because I think that's what actually the movement is already doing, like looking at how masculinity is constructed and how there's sort of more hegemonic and not so hegemonic masculinities, but also like how femininity is constructed. And because then we move a bit beyond this, these miniskirt arguments of, okay, but it's sort of her fault too. No, she's also constructed by social structure.
Okay, we have another question from Stefan.
Thanks, Jenny. There were so many great things there. I'm interested in a similar point. This idea of, you call vulnerability politics, this is a really interesting term. Maybe you could, and the role of like these awareness teams. And I started from like, okay, so like in the sexist field, like awareness teams answer to specific problems, what would be the equivalent in the drug field? And I thought maybe drug checking is in a way a similar move, in the sense of that you delegate in a way the production of safety to a specific group, be it in a, like, that is and that gets a new position within this like party context, right? And it's in its authority. And the question is, how are these authorities constructed? What is an authority of or a legitimization of an awareness group? And in the same logic, what is the credibility of these party tracking? And in party tracking, it's clearly expertise, right? It's mobilized with chemical expertise and legitimized like this. But how is it in the case of the awareness teams? How is authority constructed, and is there a specific knowledge you have to be in an awareness team that is selective?
Not really. Some people problematize this. Sort of some awareness activists problematize this, that that they feel sometimes they would need more knowledge. But as volunteers, sort of the idea is, if you've ever done a caring talk with someone from your shared apartment, that's sort of already a qualification. It's mostly based on, well, that's what they tell me. But I lost a bit track. Yeah, you sort of compare these. The problem is that these movements are so far not comparable as sort of this this topic of drugs within the alternative party spaces is addressed by a normalization movement, basically a movement that says drugs are okay. Whereas the topic of sexism is clearly addressed by a scandalization movement that says no, sexism is absolutely not okay. The legitimization, I would say, very often simply stems from the fact that they're part of the party organization. And also that I would say that there's a clear consensus in the leftist scene, which I think is good, that something needs to be done about sexism and other forms of discrimination and so on at parties. But then again, it's now that you say that, it's interesting that it's sort of, yeah, the more leftist scene attached, the more accepted, because when you look at sort of people having a bit more commercial clubs, they sometimes do question that sort of what is not working is awareness, they intervene too fast and so on. These discourses exist, but sort of the more integrated the party is in leftist structures, the more accepted.
Thank you very much. Rüdiger has a question. Rüdiger, please, your mic.
Yes, just realized. Yeah, thanks. It's more an answer to what Stefan asked, actually. I think it's a kind of deranged view, to be honest. If you just focus on drug checking services, for example, I work for now more than 20 years in harm reduction oriented services, and I'm involved in many peer networks, and we have in our network with different organizations all over Germany, we have at least, don't want to lie, but at least 200 people permanently working in this field, but only voluntarily. Of course, they are not all of them are experts, like being social workers or stuff, but they have this kind of empowerment, and as Jenny highlighted, normalization or harm reduction oriented approach, but they are really focusing on supporting others in the field, and it's not an expert focus. And I must say, I don't know who you talked with, Jenny, but well, I know a lot of let's say collectives in Berlin, especially, and I think this kind of policy and control and expert approach of sanctions and so on is not the main focus. So yeah, I mean, of course I like the presentation, and of course it's very important questions, but still I think it's a very selective look into the field.
But I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding here, because I said, or I tried to carve out that the topic of drugs and of sort of sexism, they're treated by a bit different governance structures, if you want to call them volunteers, NGOs, and so on. And I think sort of there was a bit of a conflation, like now in our communication.
All right. Louise has a question.
It's actually, thank you so much, all of you. And rather than a question, it's actually, I want to suggest that maybe Jenny and Gemma could comment on each other's idea and way of working with the concept of feminism. Because I was wondering in what sense they see this as feminism, and what does feminism mean in this context. For instance, you could say that Jenny was talking about the production of political subjects and how there might sometimes be a reference to society's power subjects, but individualized solutions. And if we could, I think the kind of critique that Gemma was talking about between what she called second wave feminism, I'm a bit critical of that concept, but we'll save that discussion for another time, because I think it's a huge generalization, but the idea about a second wave feminism. But if we accept the idea that there was this sort of generation who would say that this has to have a broader idea of solidaric solutions, and that so I think there are some times that it could be interesting to actually hear the two of you commenting. What do you learn from each other? What happens if you look at your two cases, and how are they different? How are they similar? Or how do you inspire each other when you listen to each other's talks and your ideas about feminism in these discussions?
That's a great suggestion, Louise.
Yeah, it is. Well, what struck me is that the same kind of discussions seem to still be present through the decades about what is actually true feminism or not. And I wouldn't define it myself. What interests me as a historian is sort of a constructionist way of looking at feminism and seeing how people do define it and struggle for its meaning and nature. And this kind of struggle seems still to be going on. But that's a bit of a relativist position to take, a very safe relativist position to take. I realize that. But it's one that I feel comfortable with as a historian.
I think it's maybe maybe not the same debate, but it's maybe sort of adding on the same debate, because when you said when you were making all these reference to rape girls, yeah, feeling that it's a liberation to party and sort of the gender equity and so on. This does come along in the interviews that I make, but I think there's sort of a bit of a counter movement also within the field to then after feeling, because some really actually describe it like that it was like to start with techno was so liberating, all these roads that you could try out, but then I realized like all this sexism going on, and I feel that that's maybe like a historical phase also that is reflecting why we are looking there so differently about it.
Yeah, that would be very fascinating to do oral history interviews if I will go and proceed to do that, to see if people do tell their narratives in this kind of a way too, and do the narratives differ from what I find in the sources from the 90s? Yeah. Also, I wondered if I may ask a question to the first speaker about the emotional maps. Did you find that, Roxane, when Marie and her friends did the maps, that they linked their feelings of safety or unsafety also to specific drugs that were used?
can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, when Marie and her friends did the emotional mapping of the Bordeaux area where they went out, you mentioned that at some places they felt safe or unsafe, and did they link this to specific drugs that, well, they used or the men used, or like for instance, if they were coked up or alcohol, or was it different for them or from other drugs?
The emotions in the map are the emotions for the whole festivity time. Then Mary doesn't use a lot of drugs, like she said, alcohol for sure, a bit of cannabis, and her other friends use more drugs like cocaine, MDMA. For men and women, they draw the emotions and the map about whole life in Bordeaux, and in particularly drugs uses and festivity. Not essentially drugs for sure, but they try to remember some experiences, some bad or good experiences, and the draws about the stories. I don't know if I'm clear enough. But the specific drugs they use for women, it's cannabis, cocaine, sometimes MDMA. And men, it's more cocaine for sure, alcohol and cannabis, and sometimes heroin, speed, other drugs. They consume more and different drugs as well, and in bigger quantities than women. So in the map I shown before, it's about the full life, festive life of Mary, not only drugs, because she doesn't use a lot of drugs.
Sure, thank you.
Any other questions, debates, ideas?
Yeah, maybe just very briefly on the last aspect of the drugs, because that's also something which features in my. I found that so cool that you said they say MDMA makes you sort of more empathetic and so on. Because given that I spoke to feminists about party spaces which are sort of in this fighting against sexism mode, I found it very, not very often, sometimes that they would say, yeah, it makes you more touchy. It makes men more touchy or huggy or whatever. And yeah, maybe I think that relates a bit to one of the talks we had in the very beginning of our conference series, where it was very clearly pointed out that sort of, we must be cautious. While drugs do have a material effect, we must be cautious to take them, to essentialize them. And clearly there's, I'm sure, Gemma, you didn't mean to do that at all. That it's sort of, it's part of a narrative which, especially in the sexualized context, can even help to legitimize sex, for example, for women who are always at the danger to be seen as a slut if they have too much sex, for example. But yeah, I was a bit drunk, or things like that. That this becomes sort of part of how we negotiate sexuality as well. The ideas shaped around.
Yeah, that was definitely part of the discourse, I think, in the club scene in the 1990s. Yeah. And second wave feminism, to come back to your remark, Louise, of course, is a very multi-level phenomenon. But it is really, there is a generational aspect, I think, to the discourse in the Netherlands in the 1990s. And you know, the women I mentioned, they were definitely part of the organized form of feminism in the 60s and 70s. So, but I do see your point, not grouping them together too much.
Okay. Anybody? A question, a remark, an experience? She has a request. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, Jenny, you skipped a slide about alcohol in party spaces. And I would really like to see it, just because we just had that conversation about like what kind of drugs produce what kind of like behavior. Yeah, doesn't need a lot of commenting. I just kind of want to see it.
Oh, yes, this one. I believe it's small. And yeah, that's actually an interesting question, because most like that is something that I come across in these interviews a lot, that alcohol is really problematized as the problematic drug. Of course, there are also other drugs, and a bit sometimes alcohol also features as sort of a relational argument as to we need to legalize other drugs, sort of relativizing alcohol consumption in this regard. But still, that is something that features very strongly in the interviews, that alcohol being more problematic with regard to sexual assault than other criminalized drugs.
When I like read the first slide, I thought it was not talking about like sexual violence, but about drugs, because I think from like a harm reduction standpoint, alcohol mixed with other drugs is also one of the highest risk factors. So I think maybe that's also an interesting combination.
Yeah, I must admit I cut that point out of the quote because it was super long, but a good point. Yeah. But it's really like, yeah, alcohol even as sort of a singular substance is quite a lot problematized.
That also relates a bit to, I think, a long tradition in Western counterculture to demonize alcohol, because you know, starting in the 60s, it was seen as a very banal drug that your parents used, and very commercial, and quite opposed to liberating ideals and so on. So there might be a tradition of that still, you know, moves through the decades a little bit as well, apart from the very real damage, of course, that it can occur.
Yeah, I think when I encountered it, it was very often sort of a bit of a rehabilitating argument towards other drugs, because the people are so much confronted with these bad criminalized drugs that they try to sort of rectify the picture a bit.
Very understandably so, by the way.